arrogant millionaire swore he would never let the humble maid near his special daughter. But the day he was forced to trust her, he witnessed the greatest miracle of his life. Stay with me until the end to see what miracle this was, and subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more emotional stories like this one that truly touch hearts. Dawn in Oakridge bathed the imposing facade of the Moretti mansion in light, where white marble columns upheld balconies reminiscent of European palaces. Inside, every piece of decor seemed chosen to impress. Persian rugs, signed paintings, and imported sculptures. At the heart of this scene lived Alexander Moretti, a middle-aged man whose firm posture and stern expression radiated authority. He wasn't just wealthy, he was feared. Owner of Orion Enterprises, one of the city's largest corporations, his routine revolved around million-dollar contracts and meetings with international leaders. Nothing in his life was out of place. Even the servants knew that the slightest disorder could cost them their jobs. For Alexander, the mansion was not a home but a stage of perfection on which he displayed his unshakable image of power to the world. Behind his cold eyes hid a man obsessed with control. Alexander tolerated no mistakes, neither from himself nor from others. His presence alone was enough to make any employee straighten their posture at the sound of his steps. In Oakridge, he was known as an implacable leader, incapable of accepting excuses or weakness. Even at home, he never abandoned his CEO demeanor. Every meal followed strict punctuality, every visit was recorded in his schedule, every gesture calculated as if it were a negotiation. The portrait of his late wife, Helena, over the fireplace, seemed out of place in such rigidity. Helena had been the last spark of warmth he allowed into his life. Since her death, Alexander had buried himself deeper in his obsession with keeping an impeccable facade, as if luxury and discipline could cover the emptiness consuming him from within. Alexander cared more about appearances than feelings. To society, he was a model of success, an inspiration for young entrepreneurs, and a source of pride for Oakridge's elite. But within the marble walls of the mansion, his arrogance suffocated any trace of tenderness. Not even with his daughter Sophia could he let down his guard. He saw in the little girl not only a defenseless child but a constant reflection of his own insecurities. What others would call love, he confused with possession and excessive protection. To him, showing affection was a sign of weakness, and allowing others near Sophia seemed like a threat. While tending to contracts and profits, Alexander believed he was shielding his empire, unaware that the greatest risk was turning his own home into a cold, solitary castle. In the silent corridors of the Moretti mansion, Sophia's presence was like a delicate breeze amidst its heavy grandeur. At only 4 years old, with light brown hair and wide eyes inherited from her mother, she carried an innocence that contrasted with the house's rigidity. Sophia had never spoken a single word since birth, and each failed attempt during medical consultations only deepened her father's anguish. Yet she had a unique way of communicating. She smiled with her eyes, embraced with small gestures, and observed the world with quiet curiosity. The mansion, which to Alexander was only a symbol of status, to Sophia was a lonely universe where expensive toys replaced human warmth. At times, she wandered the halls clutching a worn-out teddy bear, the only object that seemed to understand her silences. Deep down, she carried a sensitivity capable of turning even the coldest emptiness into a space of tenderness. Alexander loved his daughter, but his love was wrapped in invisible bars. Unable to cope with Sophia's condition, the millionaire transformed his concern into constant surveillance. He didn't allow her to play freely in the gardens, rejected unexpected visits, and watched sternly over any interaction between her and the staff. Affection that should have been spontaneous turned into suffocating protection. For him, Sophia's silence was a reminder of something he couldn't control, and and that terrified him. Instead of surrendering to affection, he hid behind the mask of a businessman, pretending that discipline could fill the void left by his daughter's muteness. It was as if every gesture of hers was analyzed like an incomplete report, incapable of satisfying his thirst for results. In truth, what frightened him most wasn't her silence, but the haunting sense of impotence before the inexplicable. Sophia, however, seemed unwilling to be imprisoned by the weight of expectations. She spent hours sitting on the floor of her playroom, lining up colorful blocks, drawing with simple strokes, or watching the sunlight stream through the window. Many times, she would stop in front of her mother's portrait and gently touch the frame, as if trying to speak to her in her own silence. Though she had never spoken a word, her gaze carried a tenderness that deeply moved anyone who dared approach. And even if Alexander couldn't show it, there was an unbreakable bond between father and daughter, a love smothered by fear, yet undeniably true. Sophia had the gift of turning the ordinary into something extraordinary. It was enough for her to hold a flower or rock a doll, and it seemed to come alive. In her quietness, there was a secret language powerful enough to move even the hardest of hearts. Even without words, her presence spoke louder than any speech. Every morning, before the sun fully lit the rooftops of Oak Ridge, Camila Duarte would already be passing through the gates of the Moretti mansion. She carried with her a simple bag and the serene gaze of someone who knew the weight of life, but refused to let it extinguish her kindness. Her steps were light, almost silent, and every movement seemed measured so as not to disturb her employer. Camila came from a humble family on the outskirts of the city and had accepted the job at the mansion as a blessing, though she knew she would never be treated as an equal. She scrubbed the marble hallways with care, polished expensive furniture as if it were her own, and tended to every invisible detail that preserved the house's grandeur. Yet despite her dedication, Alexander's eyes upon her were always filled with disdain. To him, Camila was nothing more than a replaceable cog in the machinery of his impeccable routine. Camila's kindness, however, was something not even her employer's coldness could erase. She greeted every worker with a genuine smile and treated Sophia with gentleness, even if she wasn't allowed to get too close. While scrubbing the steps of the grand staircase, she sometimes caught herself watching the girl play alone, imagining what it would be like to interact more freely. Within her, a maternal instinct overflowed in simple gestures. Straightening a pillow, arranging scattered dolls, carefully folding the child's clothes. But her gentleness was rarely acknowledged. Alexander looked at her as one merely tolerates a necessary presence. Never valued, always dismissed. He never missed the chance to remind her of her place. Harsh words like, "Do your job," or "Don't interfere," echoed in her mind even when he wasn't around. Even so, Camila remained steadfast, as someone who understands that dignity does not depend on social status. She knew how to swallow humiliation without letting bitterness poison her heart. Whenever she passed Helena's portrait above the fireplace, she would murmur a silent prayer, believing that the mother's kindness still lingered in that house. Deep down, she nurtured a quiet faith that her patience and her care would one day make a difference in Sophia's life. Perhaps it was naive, perhaps only hope, but Camila believed that even in the coldest places, there was still room for warmth. And it was that belief that kept her standing tall each day, even when her employer's eyes pierced her with disdain. With every wrung cloth, with every sweep of the broom, Camila left behind more than cleanliness. She left invisible fragments of love, in the hope that one day they would be noticed. The sound of Alexander's voice echoed through the mansion's halls like an unbreakable decree. In a grave and firm tone, he established his rules, making it clear that his daughter must never, under any circumstances, have contact with Camila. "Stay away from my daughter, Maid," he would repeat, as if those words built walls around Sophia to protect her. To Alexander, only people of his level, renowned doctors, highly trained nannies, specialists with flawless resumes, could approach his heiress. Camilla, with her simple background and modest uniform, would never be considered worthy. He claimed to be worried about his daughter's safety, but deep down his voice carried a profound prejudice, rooted in the belief that simplicity was synonymous with incompetence. With every prohibition, the mansion seemed to shrink a little more, as though even the walls absorbed the harshness of his words. And when Alexander repeated this warning in front of other staff, he would lift his chin high, reinforcing the hierarchy he held so dear. Sophia, though unable to fully understand her father's rigidity, could feel the distance he imposed between her and the maid. Her eyes followed Camilla in silence, as if longing to cross an invisible wall. Camilla, in turn, pretended indifference, though her heart ached each time she was pushed away. She kept to herself the desire to offer a small gesture of affection, a caress in the girl's hair, a comforting lap when she looked lonely. Yet she respected the boundaries, knowing that a single misstep could cost her the job that supported her family. Alexander, however, never saw such loyalty as proof of character. To him, it was nothing more than duty. His gaze always carried distrust, as though Camilla's kindness was a veiled threat to the perfect order he fought to impose. There was something in his haughtiness that betrayed fear, a fear disguised as arrogance, hidden behind curt words. The contrast between the daughter's innocence and the father's harshness painted a painful picture. Sophia would smile discreetly at Camilla, hiding the gesture whenever she sensed Alexander's presence. It was like a childish secret shared in silence. The millionaire, however, remained blind to such details, convinced he was fulfilling his role as protector. He failed to see that, by keeping his daughter away from a sincere presence, he was only deepening the emptiness around her. Camilla, with her quiet patience, remained steadfast, whispering prayers as she cleaned every corner of the house. The prohibition was clear, almost cruel, yet within her grew the certainty that love asked no permission, and that one day, life itself would prove this to the man who despised her so much. Even the other employees, though silent, recognized the injustice and exchanged sympathetic glances with the maid, though none dared challenge their employer. The dawn in Oak Ridge seemed to conspire in favor of Alexander Moretti's plans. The sky was clear, and the golden light reflected off the mansion's tall windows, announcing a day of victories. Inside his wood-paneled office, Alexander reviewed for the umpteenth time the documents he would present at the meeting. Orion Enterprises was on the verge of sealing a multimillion-dollar deal with foreign investors, and he knew this moment could mark the greatest leap of his career. A fountain pen rested on the desk like a sword ready to seal the company's fate. In his mind, every detail of the negotiation was rehearsed, every figure memorized, every objection anticipated. There was no room for mistakes, not even distractions. Even the hands of the clock seemed to turn more slowly, as though respecting his focus. And deep down, Alexander believed that this contract was more than just business. It was his chance to etch his name into the corporate history of the city. Anxious, Alexander paced back and forth, adjusting his tie and studying his reflection in the wardrobe mirror. He wanted to look impeccable, for he believed appearance carried as much power as words. He took deep breaths, but the tightness in his chest refused to ease. The staff knew better than to interrupt him with trivial matters on such a day, and even the sounds of the house seemed to retreat before his determination. Yet behind all that confident posture lay a hidden fear, the fear of failure. The millionaire had built his reputation on perfection, and a misstep before the investors would be unforgivable. Thus, every gesture was calculated, every phrase rehearsed, as if life itself were a never-ending boardroom presentation. For Alexander, there was no difference between the meeting room and his living room. In both, he had to win, impose himself, prove his superiority. That relentless pressure turned him into a prisoner of his own success. Meanwhile, Sophia played on the living room rug, oblivious to the storm of thoughts consuming her father. Her colorful blocks formed unstable towers that collapsed amid her quiet giggles. Alexander, passing through the room, cast only a fleeting glance, refusing to let his heart linger on that innocent scene. For him, at that moment, nothing was more important than the contract that could expand Orion Enterprises across continents. Not even his daughter's subtle smile could pierce his emotional armor. The millionaire slammed the folder of documents shut, as though sealing his fate. The driver was already waiting to take him to the meeting, but before he left, the unexpected would cross his path, reminding him that no matter how carefully one prepares, life always finds a way to surprise. And that detail, one he could neither predict nor control, was about to change not only his schedule but his entire existence. The mansion's phone rang shrill at 6 in the morning, shattering the carefully planned silence of Alexander Moretti. He was already preparing to leave, suit straightened and briefcase in hand, when he answered with the impatience of someone who tolerated no setbacks. On the other end, the trembling voice of Sophia's official nanny carried an apology. She was feverish, aching, and could not come that day. Alexander's heart clenched at once, not with compassion, but with anger. The news struck him as a direct threat to the most important commitment of his year. "Do you realize the trouble you're causing me?" he snapped coldly, though he knew the woman had no choice. When he hung up, the sharp slam of the receiver echoed through the room like a bitter sentence. The sound reverberated through the hallways, a clear sign that the day had begun under the shadow of chaos. For a few moments, Alexander stood frozen, staring into nothingness, as though searching for a logical solution to a problem that wasn't in his spreadsheets. The meeting with Orion Enterprises investors demanded his absolute presence, and canceling was unthinkable. In his mind, he saw the negotiation table, foreign executives analyzing every detail, and the risk of losing millions because of his absence. Cold sweat trickled down his forehead, revealing that behind the implacable facade was a man vulnerable to life's surprises. The clock ticked mercilessly, reminding him that every lost minute was another brick missing from the castle he tried to build. The millionaire walked to the window, took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, felt cornered within his own mansion. It was as if the luxurious walls he had built for himself had now turned into golden bars, restricting his freedom. From the hallway, Sophia observed her father with innocent curiosity, unaware of the storm of emotions he was facing. She played with her teddy bear, not knowing that the nanny's absence would completely change her day. Then Alexander heard soft footsteps and saw Camila Duarte appear, carrying her bucket and broom. His gaze hardened, as if her mere presence were a provocation. In the millionaire's mind, the solution seemed unthinkable, leaving his daughter with the maid. Yet alternatives were scarce, and time was working against him. Each tick of the clock reinforced the dilemma: risk the contract of his life, or entrust Sophia to the care of someone he despised. In that instant, Alexander realized life had placed him before an unavoidable choice. It was as if destiny had torn from his hands the control he prized so dearly, exposing him to his greatest fragility. Alexander felt his blood boil, and anger seized his every gesture. He slammed the briefcase onto the desk so hard that some papers flew and slid across the polished floor. He paced back and forth in the office, muttering harsh words that echoed like thunder through the silent mansion. Incompetence. Everything falls on me. It's always me who has to fix it, he roared, as though the entire world conspired against his perfect order. His face flushed red, his breath quickened, and his clenched fists betrayed his urge to break something to relieve the frustration. Yet not even the luxury surrounding him could offer an outlet. The situation challenged him in what terrified him most: losing control. He felt cornered, as if destiny mocked his arrogance by forcing him into an impossible decision. For a man accustomed to dictating rules, being confronted by the unexpected was an intolerable insult. Camila, who was passing through the corridor, trembled upon hearing the shouts. Her steps faltered, but she carried on, for she was already used to enduring her employer's outbursts. Sophia, on the other hand, clutched her teddy bear tightly, her wide eyes filled with fear at her father's fury. The child's silence seemed to intensify the weight of the moment, as if her innocence itself recoiled from that emotional storm. Alexander, noticing his daughter's frightened gaze, tried to restrain himself, but the words had already flown from his mouth like sharp arrows. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and realized that, whether he liked it or not, he was out of options. The meeting could not be postponed, and his daughter could not be left alone. His pride wrestled with logic, but reason spoke louder. Someone had to take care of Sophia that day. For the first time in years, the realization made him feel smaller than the very schedule he lived by. With firm steps, Alexander left the office and found Camila in the hallway. His eyes gleamed like blades, and his voice rang out like a decree. "I have no choice. You will stay with my daughter today. But if anything happens, it will be the last thing you ever do in this house." The words fell upon Camila like a heavy burden, but she did not retreat. She stood tall, gripping the bucket firmly, and only nodded in silence. Sophia, watching the scene, clapped her small hands timidly, as if sensing that something different was about to unfold. Alexander, however, saw no tenderness in that gesture. He saw only the urgency driving him out the door. Swallowing his pride, he realized that on this day, his authority would be tested in a way he had never imagined. And no matter how hard he tried to mask his unease, he knew he was leaving Camila with more than just a responsibility. He was leaving her proof that he was not as invincible as he pretended to be. Alexander stood in silence for a few seconds, staring at Camila with an expression as sharp as a blade ready to strike. His pride screamed at him not to give such an order, but reality pushed him to the edge of contradiction. With eyes blazing and jaw clenched, he finally broke the silence. "You will take care of my daughter today, not because I trust you, but because I have no choice." The words were spat with disdain, every syllable laced with resentment, as though giving that order was a personal defeat. The millionaire seemed to hate himself even more for having to rely on the maid. Camila lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but out of respect for the moment, aware that she had just been entrusted with the most delicate responsibility of her life. The entire hallway seemed to watch, as if the very walls bore witness to the fall of a man who never admitted fragility. He repeated his warnings over and over, as though trying to carve the rules into stone. "She cannot leave my sight when I'm home, and today, even if I'm away, nothing changes. I want reports on her every move. Understood? Don't let her fall. Don't let her near strangers. Don't let her cry." With every sentence, Alexander sought to reassert a control he had already lost the moment he uttered the order. His hands trembled slightly, and to hide it, he stuffed them into his jacket pockets. It was clear he was torn between the fury of depending on someone he despised and the fear that something might happen to his daughter. His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed his insecurity. Camila only nodded silently, refusing to argue, letting silence be her wisest reply. Within her, fear and courage intertwined, as if she sensed this day would be anything but ordinary. Sophia, who until then had watched in silence, stepped forward and offered Camila her teddy bear, as if sealing a pact of trust. The pure and unexpected gesture left Alexander stunned for a few moments. He tried to ignore it, but his heart quickened at the sight of such spontaneous complicity. "Don't be fooled, Camila," he said, trying to regain firmness. "This changes nothing. You are only here because I had no other choice." He then picked up his briefcase, adjusted his tie, and headed toward the door. Before leaving, he turned once more, his gaze a bitter mix of distrust and reluctant need. As the door closed behind him, the mansion breathed a different silence. For the first time, Alexander had left in someone else's hands the very thing he feared most to lose. Outside, the roar of the car's engine signaled his departure, while inside, destiny began writing a new page. As soon as the mansion's door closed behind Alexander, a different silence settled through the corridors. Camila took a deep breath, trying to shake off the sting of his harsh words that still echoed in her mind. She approached Sophia slowly, afraid the fear instilled by her father might also exist in her. But to her surprise, the little girl did not retreat. Sitting on the living room rug, clutching her teddy bear, Sophia lifted her curious eyes and fixed them on the maid. Camila knelt down to meet the child at her level, offering a gentle smile. A smile that asked no permission, only extended warmth. She held out her hand without forcing it, letting Sophia decide whether to accept. For her, that moment felt more solemn than any contract or command. It was the birth of a trust that needed to grow in silence. The air, once heavy with rigidity, seemed to soften, as if the house itself sighed in relief. With tenderness, Camila picked up some wooden blocks scattered on the floor and began stacking them clumsily. She pretended to fumble, knocking the pieces down on purpose, drawing from Sophia a muffled but genuine giggle. It was the first time someone seemed to play with her without expecting results or medical reports. Camila didn't care about the tower's perfection, only about the joy hidden in the girl's eyes. "You like this, don't you, my flower?" she whispered, knowing she might not receive words in return, but trusting in gestures. Sophia clapped her small hands timidly and, little by little, began imitating the maid's movements, stacking blocks with near-magical focus. Camila felt a warmth bloom in her chest, as though she had been welcomed into a secret territory where only love was granted entry. For a moment, she forgot the weight of responsibility and simply lived the bond being born before her eyes. Time seemed to slow down as their companionship grew natural. Camila invented little stories with dolls, turned cushions into castles, and even improvised simple songs, drumming lightly on the tables. Sophia followed everything with sparkling eyes and, though still silent, her language was in every gesture of trust, in every unguarded smile. With each passing minute, the mansion stopped being a stage of rigidity and became a living home, filled with hidden laughter. It was as though, for the first time, Sophia could simply be a child, free from the weight of surveillance and expectations. Sitting beside her, Camila felt blessed to witness such a transformation. In that instant, she realized she was not just an employee. She was part of a chapter life itself had begun to write with delicacy and hope. Outside, the sun climbed higher over Oak Ridge, as if illuminating the birth of a new bond. The hours began to pass slowly inside the mansion, but for Sophia, that day felt like a rare gift. Camila approached her with a sweetness that needed no words to be understood. Sitting beside the little girl on the rug, she began to hum simple songs she had learned in childhood, melodies that spoke of hope and dreams hidden in short verses. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, Yet to Sophia it sounded like a brand new song that filled her silences. With each note, the child's eyes sparkled, and her tiny hands clapped in rhythm, creating an innocent symphony. Camila realized that in that moment there was no mansion, no luxury, no rigidity. There was only a little girl discovering the joy of companionship. The atmosphere, once cold and controlled, was now alive, warmed by the simple act of sharing a song. After the songs came the stories. Camila improvised tales with dolls and pillows, creating characters who fought invisible dragons or built castles in the air. Sophia watched every detail with captivated attention, smiling whenever an invented character won a battle or found a treasure. It didn't matter that the stories had no fixed script. What mattered was the way Camila told them, with genuine enthusiasm and infinite patience. The little girl, who so often withdrew into her silent world, now seemed immersed in a narrative where she finally had space to dream. Little by little, she began imitating expressions, moving dolls, as if she too were part of the improvised play. The bond between them grew like a discreet flame, impossible to extinguish. The day wore on, and each minute seemed to seal the complicity between the maid and the child even more firmly. Camila cared neither for the passing of time nor for the household chores that still awaited her. At that moment, her mission was to be fully present for Sophia. Her patience was unshakable, even when the girl hesitated in a gesture or shrank back in insecurity. Instead of forcing her, Camila simply smiled and waited, respecting the child's pace. And it was in that respect that trust blossomed. Sophia drew closer each time, resting her head on the maid's shoulder, allowing herself to relax in a tenderness she had never known. For Camila, that closeness was more than a duty. It was a calling of the heart. In silence, she realized she was helping the girl discover a new way of existing, not as the millionaire's daughter, but as a child finally allowed to feel loved. The sun was already high when the living room was overtaken by an unexpected atmosphere. Sophia and Camila were playing with colorful blocks, building a tower that collapsed and began again countless times. Between muffled laughter and tiny claps, something different began to happen. The girl, who had always remained in absolute silence, opened her mouth as if she wanted to join the game in a deeper way. Camila noticed and held her breath, afraid to force any reaction. With tenderness, she simply smiled and kept stacking the blocks, creating a safe environment. Sophia persisted, moving her lips hesitantly, as if each syllable were a mountain hard to climb. That moment, simple and quiet to anyone else, was, for Camila, the most extraordinary scene of her life. The maid's heart raced, and she felt time itself stop, as if the whole world were waiting with her for the child's first word. The maid set down the blocks for a moment and moved closer, gazing at Sophia with infinite tenderness. "You can do it, my angel. Try, in your own time," she whispered, offering encouragement without pressure. The little girl tilted her head, as if searching for strength in a secret place, and moved her lips again. A fragile sound escaped, almost imperceptible, yet full of meaning. Camila's eyes filled with tears, threatening to spill, but she took a deep breath so as not to frighten the child. Instead of crying, she smiled even wider, clapping softly, as though celebrating a miracle in the making. "That's it, Sophia. You're doing it," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. The maid's heart pounded wildly, as if she were witnessing something sacred, a gift life had chosen to reveal through her. Deep within, a profound certainty grew, that love had the power to break even the hardest silences. Sophia seemed encouraged by her companion's reaction. She hugged her teddy bear tightly, gathered her courage and tried again. This time the sound was clearer, a short word, incomplete but recognizable. Camila raised her hands to her face, overwhelmed, then stretched out her arms to embrace the girl tenderly. "You are amazing, my flower. Keep going," she encouraged, kissing the child's forehead. For the first time, Sophia looked at someone and felt understood, without judgment, without suffocating expectations. The room filled with a new energy, as if every object bore witness to the birth of a long silent voice. Camila knew this moment would change everything, not only for the girl but for herself as well. It was life's miracle, proving that love and patience could open doors money and power could never unlock. In that simple embrace, the maid realized she was witnessing a victory greater than any material achievement. Late afternoon brought a golden glow into the mansion, as though even the sun wished to witness something extraordinary. Its rays pierced the heavy curtains of the living room, illuminating Sophia's face as she sat on the rug, still clutching her teddy bear tightly. Beside her, Camila improvised yet another story, gesturing animatedly to bring invisible characters to life. Suddenly, the girl opened her mouth again, but this time it wasn't just a hesitant sound. With effort, she managed to pronounce a short word, clear and meaningful. "Mama?" The word came out soft, yet audible, breaking the silence that had ruled for 4 long years. Camila's heart leapt, and tears streamed down her cheeks before she could stop them. The entire room seemed to vibrate with that small but monumental achievement. It was as though the world itself had paused to hear the voice so many had deemed impossible. Overcome with emotion, Camila gently held Sophia's hands, her face wet with tears. "You did it, my dear. You spoke," she said, her voice breaking but filled with joy. Sophia seemed to sense the importance of the moment, for she beamed, her smile pure, the kind that could light up even the darkest corners of a house. The maid clapped softly, as though celebrating a victory that belonged to everyone, not just the child. The room's atmosphere changed completely. The space once marked by rigidity and silence was now alive with joy, music, and hope. For Camila, that moment wasn't just progress in Sophia's life. It was living proof that patience and love could achieve miracles where nothing else could. It felt like witnessing a flower bloom after years of winter. And deep within her, she knew that memory would remain etched in her soul forever. Encouraged by the warm reaction, Sophia tried to repeat the word, and though the sound wasn't perfect, each attempt was a new victory. With every effort, her eyes sparkled brighter, and Camila encouraged her with tenderness and trust. The moment felt eternal, etched not only in the maid's memory but also into the mansion's very walls, which now guarded a precious secret. Outside, the sky turned shades of orange, announcing the close of one cycle and the beginning of another. Inside the house, a reverent silence took hold, but it was no longer the heavy silence of before. It was filled with meaning, brimming with emotion. Camila hugged Sophia, feeling that this word was not just a sound, but a doorway opening to a different future. A future that, until then, had seemed unreachable. And as she embraced her, she realized this would be the most beautiful secret she would have to share when Alexander returned. The clock was already striking nightfall when Alexander Moretti's black car crossed the gates of the Oakridge mansion. He returned exhausted, yet with a subtle gleam in his eyes. The meeting with Orion Enterprises investors had been a success. The multimillion-dollar contract was practically sealed, and his name would now be mentioned at business tables far beyond the city's borders. In the back seat, he mentally reviewed every detail once more, satisfied at having handled everything with mastery. For him, it had been a day of personal victory, a milestone in the trajectory of a ruthless man. He adjusted his tie, leaned back, and sighed deeply, already envisioning the next steps to expand his empire even further. In his mind, nothing could tarnish the triumph he carried in his chest. What Alexander didn't know was that behind the mansion's doors, a far greater victory had been won. One no amount of money could ever buy. Upon entering the grand hall, he was greeted by the usual silence, which to him was synonymous with order and discipline. He handed his briefcase to the butler, scanned the surroundings, and felt an almost automatic relief. Everything was exactly as he had left it. Not a single object out of place, no visible mess. He walked into his office, set his glasses on the desk, and poured himself a glass of whiskey, celebrating his successful day in solitude. The tension that had built up in his body slowly began to dissolve, and a sense of accomplishment washed over him. For Alexander, the world still obeyed his unshakable logic. Effort, discipline, and results. He had no idea that on that very day, the rules of his life were about to collapse, and that the transformation he had so long resisted had already begun under his own roof. As he walked toward the living room, he heard a light, almost musical laugh coming from within. He frowned. He didn't recall leaving the television on or authorizing visitors. The sound stirred both curiosity and a flicker of irritation. His footsteps echoed across the marble as he opened the door with the firmness of a man who demanded explanations. What he found, however, was nothing he expected. Before his tired eyes were Camila and Sophia on the floor, surrounded by blocks and dolls, immersed in an atmosphere so alive it brutally contrasted with the mansion's habitual coldness. Alexander froze for a moment, trying to process a scene that completely escaped his control. Yet he still couldn't imagine that the greatest shock of his life was only seconds away. Alexander stood frozen at the living room door, his eyes narrowing in surprise at seeing his daughter so radiant beside the maid. Before he could utter a reprimand, Sophia rose with unusual energy. Her teddy bear slipped from her hands as she ran toward her father. Exhausted from the meeting, Alexander hadn't expected such a gesture. He had grown used to seeing her timid, withdrawn, almost always hidden behind silence. He instinctively crouched down to meet her, but what came next disarmed him completely. With sweet effort, the little girl opened her mouth and spoke words clear enough to shake the very foundations of his soul. "Daddy, I'm back." A chill ran down his spine, as though the entire world had paused to hear that sound. For a moment, Alexander thought he was hearing echoes of his imagination. His eyes filled with tears against his will, and the business folder in his hands slipped, scattering documents across the floor unnoticed. Sophia's syllables echoed like music, more precious than any figure signed just hours earlier. He held her by the shoulders, incredulous, and whispered in disbelief, "You spoke." The little girl smiled, innocent, as though unaware of the greatness of her feat, and repeated, this time even clearer, "Daddy." Alexander's heart pounded, and his hands trembled like never before. The weight of arrogance, control, and coldness he had cultivated for years began to crack beneath the revelation. It was as if life itself was showing him, in just a few words, that his power had never been where he thought it lay. Camila watched the scene in silence, tears restrained, though the sparkle in her eyes betrayed her emotion. For her, there was no greater reward than witnessing such a miracle. Alexander, still in shock, lifted his eyes to the maid, and for the first time his gaze carried not disdain but gratitude, and confusion as well. The millionaire realized, albeit reluctantly, that this simple woman had achieved what all his money and countless specialists had never been able to. Sophia, clinging to her father's neck, kept smiling, repeating short, timid words, each one like a key unlocking doors once thought forever closed. The mansion, once accustomed to echoes of silence and sharp orders, now filled with the sound of a child's voice reborn into the world. And Alexander, for the first time in years, could not hold back his tears. Alexander remained kneeling in the middle of the room, unable to process what he had just witnessed. His daughter's voice still echoed in his ears like an impossible melody, a sound he had longed to hear for 4 long years. His heart, accustomed to beating to the rhythm of spreadsheets and negotiations, now thudded erratically, driven by an emotion he could not control. The millionaire felt the ground give way beneath him. All the security built on figures and contracts seemed irrelevant in the face of a single word spoken by Sophia. He looked around, stunned, and his eyes stopped on Camilla. For the first time, he did not see a maid, but a human being whose presence had brought light where there had only been silence. The rigidity of his soul, which for years had served as armor, began to dissolve in the tenderness before him. And in that moment, Alexander discovered how vulnerable he was to the power of simple love. Tears streamed down his face, and he made no attempt to hide them. He drew closer to Sophia, hugging her with an intensity he had never before allowed himself. "My daughter, you spoke," he repeated, as though needing to convince himself he wasn't dreaming. His eyes turned toward Camilla, and there was no longer arrogance or disdain there. Instead, there was a sincere, almost painful recognition that this simple woman had been the one to open the door that renowned doctors and specialists had never unlocked. Alexander inhaled deeply, trying to regain his composure, but every attempt to harden his features failed before the gratitude overwhelming him. For the first time, he felt small before someone he had always judged inferior. His mind, trained to measure achievements by contracts, now bowed before a miracle no report could ever contain. And this surrender, far from humiliating him, seemed to set him free. Camilla, deeply moved, lowered her eyes in humility, though her soul overflowed with joy. She knew she needed no applause or thanks. It was enough to know she had helped Sophia break through a barrier that had seemed insurmountable. Even so, when Alexander spoke again, this time with a calm voice, her heart trembled. "Thank you, Camilla," he said slowly, as if each syllable were hard to pronounce but necessary. The silence that followed was heavy with meaning. In that room, hierarchies had been undone, prejudices crumbled, and genuine respect was born. Sophia, still smiling, babbled new attempts at words, as if to prove this was not an isolated moment but the beginning of a new life. And Alexander, touched to the deepest part of his soul, realized he had just learned the greatest lesson of his existence. A lesson taught not by investors or professors, but by his daughter and the humility of a woman he had once despised. Alexander sat silently on the couch for a few moments, still trying to absorb the magnitude of what had happened. The weight of his own arrogance fell upon him like an avalanche, crushing the pride he had carried for so many years. For the first time, he faced himself without masks, without titles, without the shield of a ruthless millionaire. He felt ashamed of every look of contempt, every harsh order, every barrier he had built between Sophia and Camilla. Slowly, he rose, as though bearing an invisible burden, and walked toward the maid. His eyes, once cold and piercing, were now wet and fragile. His voice, once authoritarian, emerged broken. "Camilla, I was wrong. Wrong for not seeing who you truly are. Forgive me." Camilla was taken aback. Her hand still held Sophia, but her heart faltered at the scene that seemed impossible. She wasn't used to hearing words of humility from her employer, least of all from the man who had so often scorned her. "Mr. Moretti, you don't have to," she tried to reply, but was interrupted by his firm, sincere gesture. Alexander looked her in the eyes and said, "Yes, I do. You gave my daughter what no doctor could, what not even I, as her father, knew how to give: hope. You showed me that true love doesn't come from titles or wealth, but from the simplicity of a heart willing to care." These words, heavy with regret, freed him from the invisible prison he had built for himself. And for the first time, the mansion seemed to witness not an act of power, but of humanity. Sophia, between them, smiled as if she understood the change that had just taken place. The little girl held Camilla's hand tightly while resting her head on her father's shoulder, uniting them in a simple yet transformative gesture. Alexander stroked his daughter's hair and, looking again at the maid, declared, "From today on, you are not just someone who works in this house. You are part of it." Camilla could not hold back her tears, for she knew this was not just a change in posture, but a profound transformation. The arrogant man had been disarmed by the miracle of genuine love. The Oakridge mansion, once cold and silent, now filled with a new music, Sophia's voice and the reconciliation of hearts. And so, Alexander learned that life's true treasures are not measured in figures, but in the ability to love and to recognize the worth of the simplest people. If the story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, activate the notification bell so you don't miss any new videos, and of course, leave your like, because it really helps the channel keep bringing you emotional stories like this one. Thank you so much for your constant support.